The Hundred Years' War erupted from a succession crisis, but its roots reached deeper, touching questions of feudal loyalty, trade, and the fragile balance of medieval politics. Edward III of England, confident in his lineage, believed his claim to the French throne was legitimate, rooted in his mother's bloodline and the legacy of Philip IV. The French nobility, however, stood by the principle that succession should pass through the male line, disregarding Edward's claim and crowning Philip VI as their rightful king. This decision not only insulted Edward's pride, but also threatened England's influence in France, especially in the rich and vital region of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was a jewel of trade and agriculture, its vineyards and ports connecting England to continental wealth. Losing control of it would weaken English power significantly. Philip VI sought to tighten his grip on Aquitaine, summoning Edward as a vassal to do homage, a humiliating demand for a reigning English king. Edward reluctantly complied at first, bowing to political pressure, but his resentment simmered, and relations between the two monarchs grew increasingly strained. Meanwhile, economic tensions heightened. Control over lucrative wool and wine trade routes became another source of rivalry, with merchants and nobles alike invested in the outcome. Alliances with other European powers further complicated matters. Both England and France courted allies, creating a tangled web of promises, fealty, and shifting loyalties across the continent. The feudal order made everything more complex. Nobles who held lands in both kingdoms often faced impossible choices, torn between two crowns demanding their loyalty. The spark came in 1337 when Philip VI declared Edward's French lands forfeit, effectively challenging England's authority in Aquitaine and daring Edward to respond. Edward retaliated by formally claiming the French crown, escalating a political rivalry into open war and setting Europe on a path of bloodshed that would span generations. Both kings rallied supporters, calling on feudal levies and mercenaries to fight in what many believed would be a swift and decisive campaign. Instead, the war became a drawn-out struggle, marked by truces, betrayals, shifting fortunes, and the gradual transformation of medieval warfare itself. The opening years saw small skirmishes, raids, and sieges as both sides tested each other's strength and sought to secure key fortresses and towns. England's military advantage lay in its disciplined longbowmen, whose devastating volleys could pierce armor and shatter traditional cavalry charges, reshaping the nature of medieval battles. France relied heavily on its knightly cavalry, proud symbols of chivalry and honor, but vulnerable to the evolving tactics that emphasized mobility and range. The seas also became battlegrounds, with naval clashes threatening trade and coastal towns, reminding everyone that this was a war fought on multiple fronts. The papacy, based in Avignon at the time, attempted to mediate peace, but the political stakes were too high for compromise to endure. Both kingdoms framed the war as just and righteous, using propaganda and symbolism to justify their claims and rally support among nobles and commoners alike. In England, Edward adopted the French fleur-de-lis on his coat of arms, boldly declaring his ambition to sit on the throne of France. France, in turn, portrayed Edward as a rebellious vassal seeking to undermine the natural order and threaten the independence of the French crown. The war's opening phase revealed not only the ambitions of kings, but also the vulnerability of ordinary people, whose lands were raided and whose lives upended. Peasants bore the brunt of destruction, with villages burned, crops stolen, and fields left fallow, creating famine and despair across contested territories. Merchants, too, suffered losses, as disrupted trade routes made economic stability fragile. leaving both kingdoms under financial strain to support the prolonged conflict. Nobles often enriched themselves through war, seizing ransoms, plunder, or land, but many also lost fortunes, lives, and legacies in the chaos. The 100 Years' War, born of dynastic quarrels, quickly grew into a test of endurance, reshaping societies and setting the tone for centuries of conflict. By the end of its first decade, it was clear this was no short campaign, but a drawn-out struggle that would consume an age. The opening sparks of war had ignited a fire that would engulf castles, towns, and entire kingdoms, leaving a legacy of blood and ambition across France. In the early decades of the 100 Years' War, England shocked Europe with military victories that defied expectations and showcased the devastating power of new tactics. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 became one of the most famous clashes of the era, where English longbowmen humbled France's proud cavalry. Edward III led his army into northern France, carefully choosing high ground for defense, a strategic decision that would maximize the effectiveness of his soldiers. French forces, larger and more confident, charged repeatedly, expecting their armored knights to crush the English. Instead, arrows rained down in deadly, unrelenting waves. The longbow, a seemingly simple weapon, proved revolutionary. Its range, power, and rate of fire made knights vulnerable, shattering the dominance of heavy cavalry. French knights fell in heaps, their armor pierced, their horses slain, while English discipline and preparation turned chaos into overwhelming victory. The defeat at Crécy stunned France. How could chivalric warriors, symbols of medieval pride, be destroyed by common bowmen and tactical foresight? The answer lay in England's adaptation. Edward and his commanders understood the changing face of warfare, embracing strategy over sheer valor, patience over reckless charges. Crécy's victory paved the way for the Siege of Calais, a vital port that would remain under English control for over 2 centuries. Calais gave England a foothold on the continent, a base for further campaigns, and a powerful reminder of France's vulnerability. But France did not yield. The war continued, with both sides locked in a struggle for supremacy, territory, and legitimacy. A decade later, another English triumph came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, led by Edward, the Black Prince, son of Edward III. The Black Prince, young but skilled, carried his father's military genius, blending discipline with daring in a battle that would leave France humiliated once again. At Poitiers, English forces faced a massive French army led by King John II himself, a monarch determined to avenge Crécy's defeat. The English, outnumbered and pressed, relied again on longbowmen, strategic positioning, and controlled ambushes, using terrain to nullify France's numerical advantage. As French knights charged, volleys of arrows cut them down, while English infantry fought with grim resolve, breaking the momentum of repeated assaults. In a dramatic turn, King John II of France was captured alive, along with many nobles, delivering England a prize beyond measure. The ransom demanded for John was astronomical, crippling France's economy and prestige, while enriching England and reinforcing its military dominance. Poitiers deepened the crisis in France, leaving the kingdom without stable leadership and fueling unrest among the population already burdened by war and taxation. The victories of Crécy and Poitiers cemented the reputation of Edward III and the Black Prince as brilliant commanders who reshaped medieval warfare. Yet these triumphs also created overconfidence. England believed itself destined to rule France, a hubris that would eventually face new challenges. The war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the minds of people, shaping national pride, identity, and the myth of invincibility. The Black Prince, celebrated as a warrior, embodied both the glory and brutality of war, feared by enemies and adored by his soldiers. His tactics combined innovation with ruthless effectiveness, earning him fame across Europe, but also leaving scars on France's villages and towns. English dominance during this phase forced France into concessions, treaties, and temporary truces, but peace was fragile and resentment smoldered. For the French, Crécy and Poitiers were humiliations, but also lessons, showing that knightly valor alone could not win against evolving strategies. For the English, these victories were affirmations of destiny, proof that their claim to France was not only legitimate, but divinely favored. Still, war is never static. Fortune shifts, and the tide of history would not remain forever in England's favor. The brilliance of Crécy and Poitiers marked the height of English success, but it also planted seeds of overreach and resistance. The 100 Years' War was far from over, and while England basked in triumph, France began searching for new ways to reclaim honor and sovereignty. After the humiliating defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, France seemed broken. Its king was a prisoner, its economy shattered, and its pride crushed by English dominance. Yet, from this despair rose resilience. The French people, though burdened by war and taxation, were not ready to abandon their kingdom or surrender sovereignty. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles V, assumed leadership during his father's captivity. Though young, he was cautious, intelligent, and determined to rebuild France's shattered strength. Charles understood what many knights and nobles did not. Battles could be lost, but wars could be won through patience, diplomacy, and strategic endurance. He avoided reckless confrontations, refusing to give England another chance for decisive victory. Instead, he focused on stability, reform, and gradual recovery. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 brought temporary peace, ceding vast territories to England in exchange for King John's release. But it left France deeply wounded. Yet Charles V treated the treaty not as an end, but as a pause, using the time to reorganize his kingdom and strengthen defenses. He reformed taxation, secured alliances, and relied on capable advisors and commanders, particularly Bertrand du Guesclin, a general known for cunning and guerrilla tactics. Du Guesclin avoided pitched battles, instead harassing English forces, cutting supply lines, and slowly reclaiming lost territories through persistence rather than glory. This new approach frustrated the English, who were accustomed to open-field victories. France, instead, waged a war of endurance, draining its enemy over decades. Meanwhile, the French crown worked to rebuild loyalty among its nobles, calming tensions and discouraging alliances with England that had weakened France in earlier conflicts. Charles V also strengthened Paris as a center of governance, ensuring stability and legitimacy in the eyes of both the nobility and common people. The economy, though strained, began to recover under careful fiscal management. Merchants, artisans, and farmers slowly restored the lifeblood of a war-torn society. Charles avoided the flamboyance of his predecessors, choosing a quieter reign of careful planning, diplomacy, and deliberate measured responses to English aggression. This steadiness earned him the title Charles the Wise, a king who valued intellect over impulse, patience over reckless pursuit of chivalric glory. By the 1370s, French morale began to shift. The despair of earlier decades gave way to hope that recovery was possible under steady leadership. Du Guesclin's campaigns recaptured significant territories, driving the English back and proving that France could resist without catastrophic battlefield defeats. The Black Prince, once feared across Europe, suffered decline from illness and overextension, his reputation dimming while French confidence grew stronger. Charles V understood that England's resources were not limitless. War drained both sides, but time favored the kingdom with deeper resilience and larger population. As France regained territory, its sense of national identity also grew. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of lords, but as Frenchmen. The importance of collective identity, born out of struggle, planted seeds that would continue to shape France long after the war ended. Charles V's reign showed that victory was not only achieved through battle, but through persistence, reform, and the ability to outlast one's enemy. By the time of his death in 1380, France was stronger, more stable, and ready to continue resisting England's ambitions. Though challenges remained, Charles V's leadership transformed despair into determination, reminding France that resilience, not just valor, was essential to survival. The contrast between England's early brilliance and France's patient recovery revealed two very different approaches to medieval warfare and kingship. England sought decisive victories, dramatic triumphs that promised crowns and glory, while France learned the value of endurance and slow, deliberate recovery. This shift in strategy would prove crucial in the long arc of the 100 Years' War, ensuring that France's story was far from over. Charles V laid foundations that later generations would build upon, keeping alive the hope of ultimate triumph over foreign occupation and humiliation. The tide of war was beginning to turn, and though England still held powerful territories, the French spirit had been rekindled by wisdom and perseverance. The 100 Years' War entered a new phase, where resilience and national unity began to challenge the might of English steel and bowstrings. After the death of Charles V in 1380, France once again entered a period of instability. His young successor, Charles VI, was unprepared for the heavy crown. Charles VI began his reign with promise, but soon his mind faltered. Periods of madness plagued him, leaving France without steady leadership in critical times. With the king incapacitated, powerful nobles and factions vied for influence, dividing France between competing interests and weakening unity against the English threat. The Burgundians and Armagnacs emerged as rival factions, each claiming authority, dragging France into bitter civil war during an already devastating foreign conflict. This internal division proved disastrous. Instead of uniting to repel the English, French lords often fought each other, deepening the kingdom's suffering. Meanwhile, England renewed its campaigns. Under King Henry V, the English army once again landed in France, determined to revive Edward III's claims to the throne. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 became one of England's most celebrated victories. Mud, confusion, and longbows destroyed French knights, leaving the nobility devastated. Agincourt deepened France's humiliation, echoing the defeats of Crécy and Poitiers. Once again, the flower of French chivalry fell before disciplined English bowmen. Henry V pressed further, demanding recognition as heir to the French crown through the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which disinherited the Dauphin Charles. The treaty seemed to doom France. Henry married Catherine of Valois, Charles II's daughter, securing both bloodline and legitimacy, while the Dauphin's authority dwindled in exile. For many, it appeared France had reached its lowest point. The kingdom was fractured, the throne claimed by England, and the future seemed lost. But history often turns at unexpected moments, and France's salvation would not come from kings or nobles, but from a young peasant girl named Joan. Joan of Arc was born in Domremy, a small village. She grew up poor, devout, and seemingly insignificant in the grand struggles of kingdoms. Yet Joan believed she heard divine voices, saints commanding her to rescue France, restore the Dauphin, and drive out the foreign invaders. Her conviction was unshakable. Despite her humble birth, she sought an audience with the Dauphin, eventually convincing him to grant her a small army. Clad in armor, carrying her banner, Joan inspired troops with fervent faith. To soldiers weary of endless defeat, she became a symbol of divine purpose. In 1429, Joan led the French to relieve the siege of Orléans, a decisive turning point in the 100 Years' War. Her presence electrified the French. Against odds, they broke the siege, proving that England's domination was not inevitable. And France still had hope. Joan pressed further, urging the Dauphin to be crowned at Reims. This coronation, long a tradition for French kings, symbolized legitimacy and divine approval. The Dauphin, now Charles VII, owed his crown in large part to the courage and faith of a simple peasant girl from Domremy. Yet Joan's story was not destined for triumph alone. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, she was handed over to her enemies. Accused of heresy and witchcraft, Joan endured a sham trial. Her faith never wavered, even as she faced execution. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen. Her death shocked France and transformed her into a martyr. Though Joan perished, her legacy endured. Her courage revived national spirit, convincing France that victory was possible even in the darkest hours. Charles VII, though hesitant during her lifetime, ultimately built upon the hope she had inspired, continuing the long struggle against English occupation. The rise of Joan of Arc revealed the extraordinary power of faith, courage, and symbolism in the course of history. She demonstrated that even one unlikely figure could alter the fate of nations, defying expectations and reshaping the trajectory of a seemingly doomed kingdom. France, once shattered by defeat and division, now found its resolve strengthened by the memory of a peasant girl who had dared to believe. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. England's supremacy would never again appear as unstoppable as before. Joan's story became inseparable from France's destiny, a reminder that hope can rise from despair and faith can ignite a nation's survival. Following Joan of Arc's death, France faced the challenge of maintaining momentum, rebuilding morale, and consolidating authority under Charles VII. Her inspiration lingered, encouraging soldiers and citizens to continue resisting English occupation across northern and western France. Charles VII implemented military reforms, creating a professional standing army that reduced reliance on mercenaries and feudal levies, ensuring better discipline and cohesion. This new army, well-trained and better supplied, allowed France to conduct sustained campaigns, reclaiming lost territories with increasing efficiency. The French used a combination of siege warfare, attrition, and strategic maneuvering to regain towns previously held by England. Key victories at towns such as Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Patay signaled a shift in the balance of power. English forces, accustomed to battlefield dominance, struggled against this revitalized French military, often overextended and demoralized in unfamiliar terrain. The Loire Valley became a center of French resurgence, where Charles VII's forces systematically liberated communities from English control. Charles VII's leadership emphasized caution, patience, and long-term strategy, avoiding unnecessary losses while steadily eroding English authority. French commanders like La Hire and Dunois followed Joan's tactical principles, blending mobility, surprise, and morale to secure victories. The English, weakened by internal conflicts and financial strain, could not maintain their expansive territories across France. French recapture of Normandy, Maine, and Anjou restored significant portions of territory lost decades earlier, strengthening the kingdom politically and economically. Sieges of fortified towns became a hallmark of French strategy, combining artillery, engineering, and persistent pressure to compel surrender. The use of cannons and gunpowder increasingly aided French campaigns, marking a shift toward modern siege warfare. As English influence waned, French morale soared, fostering a renewed sense of national identity and unity after years of division. The French crown consolidated power over former rebellious nobles, ensuring loyalty and smoother administration in reconquered regions. The Navy played a role as well, controlling rivers and coastal access to cut English supply lines and reinforce French campaigns. The 100 Years' War entered its final phase, with France holding strategic initiative and England unable to respond effectively. Reclaimed towns flourished under restored governance, encouraging merchants, artisans, and farmers to rebuild communities disrupted by decades of war. English garrisons grew isolated, and communication with England became slower and more dangerous due to harassment by French forces. French propaganda emphasized victory, divine favor, and the legacy of Joan of Arc, inspiring citizens and soldiers alike. Charles VII's coronation at Reims, reinforced by military success, strengthened royal legitimacy and symbolized the resurgence of French sovereignty. The recovery was gradual but relentless, with France systematically reclaiming lost ground while minimizing internal conflict. English political instability, combined with financial exhaustion, limited their ability to launch effective counterattacks. Local resistance also hindered English occupation, as towns and peasants refused cooperation, sabotaging supply lines and providing intelligence to French commanders. By the 1440s, most English-held territories in central and southern France had been retaken, leaving only a few coastal strongholds. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the final significant clash, where French forces decisively defeated the English, signaling the effective end of the war. The victory restored French sovereignty, national pride, and control over the majority of the kingdom, ending nearly 116 years of intermittent conflict. The 100 Years' War had transformed France, centralizing power, professionalizing the military, and strengthening national identity in ways that endured long after hostilities ceased. France's resurgence demonstrated the importance of leadership, organization, and the enduring influence of symbols like Joan of Arc in achieving lasting victory. The 100 Years' War reshaped France and England, leaving lasting political, social, and cultural consequences that defined the trajectory of both kingdoms for generations. France emerged with a stronger monarchy, more centralized authority, and a renewed sense of national identity forged through decades of struggle. The war stimulated innovations in military strategy, including the use of professional armies, artillery, and combined arms tactics that would influence European warfare. England, though defeated, retained important territories and strengthened parliamentary authority as the crown relied on taxation and governance to fund prolonged campaigns. The rise of gunpowder and cannons transformed siege warfare, gradually making castles less dominant and signaling the end of medieval fortification strategies. Joan of Arc's influence endured, inspiring patriotism, religious devotion, and the idea that individual courage could shape history in extraordinary ways. The devastation of rural lands, famine, and disease highlighted the vulnerability of civilian populations during protracted conflicts and the long-term human cost of war. Feudal obligations weakened as centralized armies became more critical, shifting power away from traditional nobility and toward monarchs and professional commanders. Economic recovery was slow but steady, with towns and trade gradually re-establishing pre-war commerce and agriculture in reclaimed territories. The war reinforced the importance of legitimacy and dynastic claims, shaping political decisions and marriages for decades across Europe. The French crown emerged more powerful, capable of maintaining authority over nobles who had once been semi-autonomous and rebellious. England's sense of identity shifted, with focus on governance and internal politics, as overseas ambitions became harder to sustain. The war also left a rich legacy in literature, chronicling heroism, tragedy, and national struggle, influencing art and storytelling for centuries. Peasant revolts and social unrest highlighted economic pressures exacerbated by war, leading to long-term reforms in labor and taxation systems. Military tactics evolved, including greater emphasis on infantry, archers, and flexible formations over traditional heavy cavalry dominance. The war fostered nationalism as people increasingly identified as French or English, rather than solely loyal to local lords or regions. Art and architecture reflected war's influence, with churches, cathedrals, and monuments commemorating victories and honoring fallen heroes. Trade networks gradually expanded, adapting to the post-war landscape and benefiting from stability under stronger centralized monarchies. The English crown's defeat led to internal tensions, contributing indirectly to civil conflicts, such as the Wars of the Roses. France, empowered and united, would emerge as a major European power, ready to shape the politics and wars of the Renaissance. The war illustrated the changing role of women in times of crisis, as exemplified by Joan of Arc, whose leadership transcended traditional gender roles. Royal courts became centers of cultural and political life, hosting diplomacy, art, and education that reinforced the monarchy's authority. The long conflict emphasized the importance of intelligence, communication, and strategy, laying groundwork for more organized modern armies. Regional identities within France were gradually integrated into a national framework, strengthening cohesion across formerly divided territories. Diplomacy became essential as alliances, truces, and treaties influenced outcomes even when armies clashed on battlefields. The 100 Years' War demonstrated that endurance, planning, and resilience could overcome short-term defeats and reshape nations over time. The conflict left deep psychological scars, but also inspired legends, literature, and collective memory that defined French and English historical consciousness. France's recovery highlighted the interplay between leadership, morale, and citizen support in securing lasting victory against a formidable enemy. By its conclusion, the war had transformed the political map of Europe, signaling the decline of feudal fragmentation and the rise of centralized states. The 100 Years' War stands as one of history's most transformative conflicts, illustrating the power of resilience, leadership, and national identity in shaping nations. From Crécy and Poitiers to Joan of Arc, the war combined tragedy, heroism, and strategy, leaving lessons still relevant for understanding power and society. France's triumph demonstrated that patience, reform, and unity could reclaim lost ground, while England's experience emphasized the limits of military conquest without sustainable governance.